Hello and welcome to the Scuttlebutt, the destination for current and former service members looking to make better decisions, think deeper, and earn more money. I'm your host, Brock Briggs. Thanks for tuning in to my conversation today with Ryan Pavel. I have to take a moment here to also say thank you for being with me up to this point. This is episode number 52. 52 weeks of consecutive weekly episodes is so wild to think about. Starting a year ago, I couldn't have told you that this would happen. Naturally, around any milestone, you have the desire to reflect on what you're doing and things you may want to change. I've got a solo episode coming where I'm going to talk about the things I've learned in a year of podcasting, what I've learned about myself and the veteran community, and also the things I've changed my mind on. Here's a hint. It's a lot. The thing I know for sure is that what I've learned and the things that I've gained from doing this have shown me that I need to double down on this project. The last few weeks, I've been taking some steps to do that, and I'll talk more about that in the coming episode. I appreciate you being on this ride with me and supporting me. I have a big announcement coming next week to celebrate the anniversary with more details on that to come. But for now, let's talk about Ryan. In this conversation, we talk about why growing up playing video games is a differentiator. Ryan landed a job at a law firm from playing Destiny. He had a really great LinkedIn post on, kind of a funny story to get the conversation started. We also talk about understanding the quantitative and qualitative impacts of your military service and how higher education plays into the life of a veteran. We talk a lot about higher education because Ryan is the CEO of the Warrior Scholar Project, a nonprofit focused on preparation for education after service. As someone who is very intimidated about returning to school after service, this resonated with me in a big way. Not only are you preparing to transition out of military life, going back to or starting in the education system is a bit scary. If you're like me, I bombed out of college the first time and couldn't cut it, didn't have the discipline to make it happen. The military helped me with that, but that's only in hindsight, and I didn't know it right away. Warrior Scholar Project helps vets prepare for that transition to education with a really rigorous program that sets the tone, encourages, and gets you plugged in with some great people at the university you're going to be attending. But I'll let Ryan speak about that more. Enjoy my conversation with Ryan Pavel. I was kind of thinking of different ways to introduce you, kind of judging by your LinkedIn title, but it has changed every day that I've looked at it. So I don't really quite know the best title to give you. I think maybe a more apt way to start the conversation might be for you to tell me the story of how you landed a job in law from playing Destiny.
Yeah, it's it's one of my favorites because it has the benefit of being, I think, unique and true, and funny. So yeah, so I changed my goal is to make LinkedIn a place that isn't just so repetitive. I'm really tired of every LinkedIn post following the exact same formula, and kind of being something where there's a really clear path to engagement on LinkedIn if you want to get there. And there's a formula that is really successful and arguably is one that I should be employing, but I just kind of get tired of it and the ways that people tag each other, the sort of topics. And I want to be able to inject some personality and some reality into LinkedIn. And not to say that everybody on there is fake. There are a lot of real people on there, but I don't know. I have this idea of doing something on there a bit different. And we can talk more if you're interested in sort of the overall state of social media. And I think if it wasn't for my job, I probably would have at some point just taken a complete hiatus from all of social media, but it's not really in the cards here. So in essence, I made a post 5 or 6 weeks ago that I hazard a guess that nobody else has ever uploaded a picture of Fogoth, the Unchained, or whatever his name is from Destiny, to LinkedIn. And so I was thinking, all right, that's kind of arresting, right, in a clever way, and people would be interested in reading it. And so the story essentially, in a nutshell, and then I can go through more of the details, is that I legitimately got my my job in corporate litigation and big law at a AmLaw top 50 firm, through a connection that I made while slaying this monster Fogoth on Xbox, playing a game called Destiny, right? And my late father, who, really detested the amount of hours that I poured into video games, right? For me to be able to call him up after I got that offer and say, Dad, look, I told you the video games weren't all a waste of time. Here you go. It all worked out.
I have a personal note here, like in my outline, talking about how interesting gamers are just in general. I don't know if you would consider yourself that, but there are a lot of like interesting stories and interesting like companies founded by people who are like, it's always like D&D
Yeah.
or like some kind of like strategy game. I don't know if there's something that how gaming kind of works, the mechanisms in our mind or whatever, and gears people towards that. But I think that that's an interesting correlation, and we're going to get into you being the CEO of a company now, a little bit later. But I think that that's an interesting correlation.
Yeah, I mean I agree. I think that so I've gone through different stages of gaming. Video games have played as in many of our lives have played this really interesting role. And even about something to another real part of myself, I don't game much now, but it's not for lack of desire. I have a condition called chronic multi-symptom illness, which is in essence the VA's diagnosis of a cluster of symptoms that they don't know what else to call it. And the working theory is that it's tied to toxic exposure, and so that's now getting a lot more attention because of the PACT Act, which is a good thing that it's getting more attention. But in 2016, I basically started getting a pain in my hands and my wrists that never went away. So it's kind of like started out as like a small carpal tunnel, and I had that for years, and I thought it was something which wasn't anything bigger. And then it's just like a switch flipped in August of 2016. And so that essentially shut down my ability to play games, right, for any sort of sustained period of time. So I think that I'm an on again, off again gamer, right? The Halo lands from high school, those are some of my fondest gaming memories, right? Getting everybody into somebody's basement, getting hopped up on Mountain Dew and Reese's and whatever other junk food we could find, and just playing till late in the night. And yeah, and then when I was gone, when I joined the military, and one of the ways that I stayed connected to my friends was just through Xbox Live, right? And being able to maintain those friendships, and so it really played this pivotal role. And then ultimately that same group of friends, it was a friend of a friend that we were killing some time in one of these missions, right? In Destiny. And then that's what led to this conversation that ultimately led me to this job. So, I mean, I think that there is, for me, the biggest aspect is really like the community element. Like I'm a very relationship driven person and a very connection driven person. And I found that video gaming, for one way or another, I'm not particularly interested in just like single player games on my own, right? I like the multiplayer. I like being able to be with people. I like being able to build those connections. So, yeah.
It's interesting how the public perception of gaming and communities online has like changed over like the last, I don't know, particularly the last 5 years, but it's been coming for like the last maybe 20 years. I remember playing like Diablo 1 online, and
Yeah.
went down the whole World of Warcraft and like Xbox rabbit hole and the whole thing. And I remember being and playing on dial up too. So like
Right.
the pain and struggle of that, but explaining to my parents and friends of like, oh, I'm playing with this person in this other country, and thought that that was really interesting. And back then it was more like kind of scary. And
Mm-hmm.
then now there are like, streaming really took off, and like a whole bunch of money started pouring into the space, and it's drastically different now.
Yeah, I think it is. I think things have changed a lot. And you think about even something like, the bane of microtransactions and pay to win, right? And I think that there's something about part of the reason that I long for those, or I think fondly about the setting up a LAN in somebody's basement, is just the simplicity of it, right? I mean, at its core, people were just, we were having a lot of fun with each other, and it's very innocent fun, right? And this is also kind of falls in the category of like, oh, like the world used to be so much simpler. So I'm aware of that bias when I look back on it, but I do think that it was simple, right? And it was safe, right? I even think about, so I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I've just very recently started introducing them to, to some games. They don't see it a ton, again, because I can't really functionally game. I can, but I don't, because I have a really small amount of time that I can actually like manipulate a controller. So I just don't really do it. It's not worth it, because then I start to like want to do it more, but then I can't, because otherwise I'll have that sort of pain ramped up for a couple of days. But I've just started introducing them to games, and it's really interesting thinking about as they latch on to that, right? They are latching on in a very different world than when I first started playing, Super Nintendo way back when, right? Or N64. As soon as they get a phone, right? everything is accessible, right, on a phone, on these devices. So yeah, I mean, it's formative for all of us, but I think you're right that there's some really big shifts, and how these things have, how they shape us over time.
What gets you interested in joining the Marine Corps?
There's a few different aspects to it. One is I am fairly confident that had I been accepted to my college of choice, I would have gone to college, right? And so I'm very thankful. Shout out University of Illinois for rejecting me, as a high school senior. I got accepted elsewhere, but no places that I really wanted to go. And again, I'm a relationship driven guy, and so my friends were, most of them were going to University of Illinois, right? And so that was the place that I really wanted to go. And I was half in, half out. I was a very apathetic high schooler, more interested in Halo 2 than I was in, anything else. Which side note, by the way, I will say part of the reason I joke about, my dad and how gleeful I was to be able to go back to him and to say, hey, I got this job at, Winston and Strawn as a result of networking literally through gaming, was when Halo 2 came out. I snuck out of the house and we all bought it at midnight, and then went home and played it. And just for the next, month, like that's all that we did. Everything was this game. And I came up from the basement late one night, and just on the coffee table, right at the crest of the stairs, my father had printed out, just in big bold letters, addicted, right? And then he printed out the Webster's dictionary definition of addiction, right? And it's like, I'm not addicted. If I was addicted, I couldn't stop. And he said, so stop. And so then I went and sold my Xbox. So he won, I guess, right, in that regard.
He got what he wanted.
Yeah, but years later, I bought another one. So, but in any event, I mean, that's kind of my mindset, right? I grew up in a household that was very very driven. My parents are both very driven and accomplished in their own right and have their degrees. So I was just very apathetic. And so when I was applying to college, I was doing it because that was the next logical step, right? Like, it seems like the thing that people do, but I didn't really like the idea of going and, either using money that my parents would pay, or taking out my own loans, whatever that is. It didn't seem like the right usage of money, but I still would have gone. I'm fairly confident had I gotten a U of I. So that was in late 2004, when I got that rejection. There's a lot going on in the world and in the news at that time. And so I think that everybody at that time, I paint with a broad brush and say just about everybody probably had some sense of like, okay, like call to action and patriotism and service. And so that was in the back of my mind. This rejection is here, right? I kind of acknowledge that I'm not really rising to my potential. And then there's a persuasive Marine Corps recruiter, right, who comes along. And as soon as I started having those conversations, it's like, okay, this is the thing. I was really sold on the idea of the meritocracy, right? And I think that holds true. I think at the junior enlisted ranks, at least, it is meritocratic in the sense that you either can do the thing or you can't, right? They don't really care where you came from or what your background is. And so it snowballed into this is the right thing for me to do at this time.
At that time, and then maybe compared to now, would you have considered yourself a person for others?
A person for others in the sense of service oriented and trying to be able to, not really then. I didn't really have many service oriented things. I grew up in a evangelical Christian house. And so there's church and there's volunteer opportunities through that, but that was probably the extent of it, right? I didn't have much of a drive to really be able to put others first. Again, I go back to this thing of like the relationships and these people that I still am close to all these years later, but that's not really putting others first. Is the Marine Corps was an important time for me to be able to really embrace service in a way that I hadn't before, even though I had, deeply mixed feelings about the outcomes of that service. By the time that I left, it still does instill in you coming together to be able to serve something more. So now, yes, right. I mean, now I have a very hard time imagining not being in a service oriented industry, right? Like, I was having a conversation with a couple friends recently, both of whom are doing very well at their, for-profit companies. One is the founder, the other one is sort of somebody else who's on the ground floor, and just thinking through 10 years from now, what kind of companies are we going to be at? And I have a hard time seeing myself not in the nonprofit industry or potentially government work, but really something which is service oriented, because that's, now I know a bit later in life that's the sort of thing that really drives me, that I'm interested in doing.
What were those outcomes that you said that you were conflicted about after your time in the Corps was closing?
Yeah, I mean, we could, depends how long you want to roll the tape for, right? We could just, and I could ask you the the same questions, having listened to a bit of your own take and your thoughts on service and your journey. As a side note, I think that that's part of the richness of the veteran community. I really push back on most broad statements about veterans. I think that they're often overblown. I think that they're misleading, and sometimes they're misleading in a, like, people are trying to paint veterans with too positive a brush, and sometimes it's too negatively, right? Like hero worship, or PTSD, people, like, as if every veteran is dealing with those things. But I think that there are some things that unite veterans, and most people have some degree of some aspects of their service that they agree with and some that they disagree with, right? Some things that they wish had gone differently. And part of the richness of the veteran experience is understanding what people derive from their service and how they leverage that into whatever comes next. I feel like there's some commonalities for transition, but there are, I've yet to hear two stories that are exactly alike. For me, the a lot of it came from being deployed. We got to Iraq in 2008, went back and forth twice. Then we came out in February 2010 when all Marines were out of Iraq. We were back in, a couple of years later. So but we thought we were going to be one of the last contingents of Marines to leave Iraq for good. But a lot of the things that we were doing there was post-surge. And so I was an Arabic translator. And so the materials that we were translating and the things that we were part of, it seemed, I got a sense from the work that I was doing that not everything was copacetic, right? And that some of the decisions that we had made as a country, and as, the coalition forces and coalition provisional authority early on in our occupation in Iraq, made a really set the stage for some really difficult things down the road. So policies like what we did with the Iraqi military or Iraqi politics. And that really started to trouble me when I was there, right? And as I was getting out and thinking about, like, is it a net positive? Is the work that we're doing there, is it a net positive? And are my contributions a net positive? All right. So you talk about this notion of service. I'm very proud of my, I'm very proud of my service, but there's sort of this cognitive dissonance because at the same time, I still have this enduring question about, whether the things that I did in service were a net positive. You think about sort of the global scale of, what somebody can do with their time. If I had spent those 5 years in some other sort of occupation, could that have led to a greater good? And then I unpacked a lot of that when I was at Michigan, when I was completing my undergrad after I left, through an academic lens, right? And reading about all of that and writing about all of that and trying to get a different perspective as a veteran, as opposed to somebody that's boots on the ground. And that helped, right? I think a lot of this also falls into the category of moral injury. So I certainly consider myself to be somebody that, works through that. And I think a lot of us do. I don't really think that there's enough conversation around that too. Sometimes it can feel kind of like a weak position to be talking about moral injury when there's so many people that are dealing with physical injuries. But I think it's an important part of the conversation.
A former of my guests, Tom Schumann, is in the Marine Corps active duty still. I believe he's a major. He talks about moral injury a lot, and it's a very important concept. I think it's interesting that you said that you got a lot more from your service and learning about it from writing about it and through an academic lens. And for a moment there, I was thinking about our capacity to process the things that are going on while you're active and while you're carrying out the day-to-day mission. And yeah. I don't know that anybody is thinking about that. Like I so many days I just am trying to like make it through a day, much less thinking about the repercussions of actions, where I fit in like the larger scheme of our nation's defense plan and what that looks like in a practical sense. What do you think that you took away from your academic studies that maybe wasn't in front of your eyes at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple, just to go back to what you were saying before I use that to answer your question. I think that you're right that part of it is it's the wolf closest to the door, right? It's accomplishing the mission. It's doing the thing that's right in front of you. And so you don't necessarily have time to process. But I also think, it's remarkable. I was really surprised. It makes sense, but I was really, when I thought about it more, but I was really surprised when I learned that the Marine Corps plans on replacing the people that are really know the numbers would cringe when they hear me say this with my broad estimations, but it's something like 30 to 40,000 Marines every year, right? That like the churn rate is built in. It's not the assumption, like it's not a problem if there's 30 to 40,000 Marines that are leaving each year. And people like me that did one enlistment, right? On its face, that seems like a loss leader, right? Like they were treating me as a loss leader, they trained me up, and then they only got a few years of real use out of me. But that's part of the way that the military functions, right? Is folks that they know are only going to do one enlistment or two enlistments, or if you commission, right? That it's not as if everybody who's commissioning is doing their 20 or 30, right? Certainly not. And so you're reliant on people that are willing to execute the mission for a certain period of time, but that I think one of the main reasons that people would get out is they start to have some version of these questions, right? Of like, what is the work that I'm doing here? And as you develop, right, even like developmentally, what could I process when I was 17 as compared to 22, right? There's a meaningful growth and perspective there. I was thinking about this recently with the recruitment challenges, where there are some MOSs, I think in particular for Air Force Special Forces, where the initial enlistment bonuses are somewhere like $60,000 to $75,000, right, for like initial contract signing. And to me, that's wild, because I was thinking, they threw a healthy enlistment. I would have been eligible for a healthy enlistment bonus, and I've been deployed to be tax-free, all of these things, but I had already made my mind up, right? Like, no, I'm doing one enlistment and then I'm out. So it didn't sway me even temporarily. But I'm thinking about like the incentive structure. If you're throwing that amount of money at somebody who's 17 or 18 years old, right? Like I'm not sure I'm down for that incentive structure of these massive enlistment bonuses. Not only, not the re-enlistment bonuses, and those are few and far between, right? It's not this, this article is from a couple months ago what I was reading. So it's not as if this is something which is made available en masse, that anybody who raises the right hand now is getting this huge chunk of change to do their initial enlistment. But the incentive structure really matters, and you don't necessarily have time to stop and think. And I also think it's fairly clear to say that the military doesn't want everybody to be processing those things on all of those levels, right? Like you need a certain number of people that are going to take the mission and accomplish the mission. Even embedded in the oath, so I like doing this with Warrior Scholars, the oath of enlistment and the oath to commission are different, right? And a lot of people don't know that. And so it's this interesting exercise to actually tease those two things out and to identify the differences. They're largely the same, but in essence, officers are entrusted with a certain amount of discretion, right? Which makes sense, right? That's the part of the reason for the separation between commissioned officers and the enlisted ranks. Whereas enlisted folks are not past that same amount of discretion, right? It's much more in terms of accepting the orders and following through on the orders. And I think I don't know. It's fascinating to me, right? Because we don't think about that when you're 17, right? You just enlist, right? Or after you do a little bit of college, and you say, all right, well, you know what? My original plans didn't work out, so let's go, Navy. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I was just reading an article before we started this conversation, a random post from LinkedIn that was saying that the Coast Guard was offering enlistment bonuses for culinary specialists, which there's a need for every job in the military. But I thought that was, and it was healthy. I think it was $40,000 or $45,000, which is very healthy for somebody with no experience.
Right.
And it does make you kind of question the incentive structure. What do you think the incentives ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should clarify too that I don't even necessarily think on its face, it strikes me as problematic, right? The initial hefty enlistment bonuses, but that's not, I haven't spent enough time thinking about it or had enough conversations with folks to really be able to come to a judgment of this is a problem, right? It's just sort of my internal reaction to that is, right? There's something different about re-enlisting at a period of time that what this is, what you're signing up for versus when you actually have, frankly, no idea, right? No matter what a recruiter tells you, no matter how many people, family members you have in the military, right? Like you don't really know, right, what you're signing up for. That's part of the package. I think that the incentive structure for something like indirect benefits, as opposed to just like pure compensation of a signing bonus, things like the GI Bill, I think are the right incentives, right? Like I think that is, I got out in 2010, and so it was right after the post 9/11 GI Bill came out. I am a very fortunate beneficiary of the post 9/11 GI Bill for undergrad and graduate school. I think that is a loosely broadly speaking, that is the properly calculated incentive, right? Because you do this service, you earn these benefits, right? You have to serve X amount of time to be able to unlock these things. And to the extent you as a 17 or 18-year-old, and I keep saying 17 or 18, I understand that people enlist outside of that range, but I'm kind of thinking about like the bottom, you can't be younger than 17 and enlist. And then it needs that parental waiver. And at 18, you don't need that waiver. But, you as a high school graduate, you want to go to college at some point. You're maybe like me, you're looking for some additional purpose. You need to, get yourself in gear, but you need to do a certain amount of service in order to qualify for those benefits. I think that's right. Yes, you do have some people that sign up just for the benefits, but I don't know if that's a problem. In fact, I don't think it's a problem, right? Like if that's the reason that somebody's signing up, not everybody has to do it because they're, bleeding heart, patriot, America, right? Want to serve my country, in any sort of thing. I think that you have to have the desire to serve your country, but I think that's okay if that's your third or fourth, fifth, thing down the row of what you're actually enlisting for.
Thinking about incentives, and I just kind of stepping back for a minute, I have learned so much about my service just talking to people over the last year, and have learned leaps and bounds more, and maybe it's just processing more than what I actually kind of took away from being in. Thinking about money as an incentivizer or an incentive for people to kind of stay in, it's interesting to me when that is thrown around as a reason for people to stay in. And even schooling to some extent, not that that's not, schooling it's expensive, it hands down is, and it kind of, quite frankly, out of control outside of the GI Bill. I mean, we're not writing the check anymore, but
Right.
It's interesting when money becomes an incentive, when you look at the pay structure of corporate America and then compare that to, like, I had Ben Coleman on, and he was talking about how as like a first year McKinsey associate is making as much as like an O6. Like, where is you're certainly not staying in for money. And I think that serving your country really needs to be the reason you need to stay in. And or if you're going to stay in, that should be at the top of the stack. And I don't know if there's anything that is actually understanding. I think what I know about the world now, there's not much that can supplant that when it comes to what the actual value of the other things that you're getting are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, right? I mean, and I would push on that a little bit for two reasons. One is, I would say, just trying to think, I mean, do I agree that the reason should be for somebody to re-enlist, that at that point, the assumption would be they know enough about the military and they're re-enlisting out of a desire to serve. I don't know if I agree that has to be that should be the primary reason for them. Because even there, you think about what happens a lot of times is somebody at that point, this is what they know, right? They might like the individual, they might like the job that they do. They might have a family at that point, and they see this as, as the next step for them to be able to, a re-enlistment allows them to be able to continue this thing that they enjoy doing. Even there, I think if desire to serve, right, if a call to serve is secondary or tertiary, I think somebody could still be a good leader. But the thing that I struggle with, and that I know a lot of veterans struggle with as well, is you look at the folks that got in and those that stayed in and those that got out, right? And you think like, well, like, could we exchange a couple people on that, right? Like, could we get some of the people that got out, right? We need them to stay in, right? Because they're the ones that, like, I think they're thinking about things in the right way, and that's the reason they got out. And some of the people that stayed in, you think like, well, from what I know about them, right, if and their incentive structure and sort of who they are, right, I don't know if I necessarily want them being a leader of Marines. And that's tough because you're powerless in that sense, right? And so again, I think this is built into the inherent churn of like what the Marine Corps is looking for. And this is not unique to the Marine Corps. It's just that's where I have, a little bit more insight. But I think it's understood that people are going to be getting out, but I don't know if the incentives really are all that much better for people that are re-enlisting. I would hope, right, at that point they're more experienced, they know more about what they're signing up for, which again is why I think I'm more okay with a re-enlistment bonus as opposed to an enlistment bonus. But I think it's still muddy at that point. What actually causes somebody to re-enlist?
One last thing on that topic, and then we can move on. I personally think I worry the most about people staying in to be safe. I think that safety, because it's this every 2-week paycheck.
Right.
And I know so many people that I feel like what's choosing to stay in and make a career is a binary, like you're either doing that or you're not.
Right.
And it's
Right.
not a constant evaluation process.
Right.
And they maybe don't feel that they have the skills or the resources or the knowledge, like they're too deep in to get out. And I don't know that that's the right way or the right reason to stay in either.
So with that, on that, I am completely agreed, right? And
Okay.
I would even take that one step further, which is those are not good reasons to stay in, right? If it's like, I don't know what else to do, I don't feel like I can go anywhere else, and then to reenlist, I think that is deeply problematic, right? And I do think that you're right that there's a number of people that do reenlist. And this is part of where not just the work that Warrior Scholar Project does, but like other organizations should be able to help fill that gap. And indeed, even like the actual transition assistance program, when somebody's already made the decision to get out, should be able to fill that gap about building those types of structures outside of the military. But I think it's a challenge. I think that it really is a main reason for people to stay in. And you don't want somebody who's in these incredibly important positions, right, rising through the ranks there just because they weren't sure if they, what else to do.
I
That's
agree.
not great.
It is scary thought to think about people in those positions and kind of just doing it on a whim because
Yeah.
there's no other option.
Yeah, and so what I guess the other thing I would say on this is I don't want this to come across as so cynical that I think everybody who reenlists is doing it for the wrong reasons. I think some people certainly do. I just don't think that I'm in a particularly good place to judge whether a reason is right or wrong, right? I was very confident for myself that it was time for me to get out, and I am still very confident about that. I've been somewhat surprised by the number of folks that I serve with who have either gone back in or who have contemplated going back in, right? For me, even though all day, every day, I am working with veterans, I love this work. There's literally no job I'd rather have than this one. I'm extremely privileged to be able to say that. Nothing about that makes me wish that I was still in the military, right? Like this is my group, right? Is thinking about the folks that are like in higher education. Okay, let's go, right? I can make an impact there. But yeah, if you had asked me to write down a list of all the people that got out when I got out, of who I thought would go back in, I would have been wrong, quite wrong. Which leads into this other interesting category of people that enlist, get out, and then decide to go back in. What's the incentive structure there? Is it that safety? Is it that known factor? Or is there really some other sort of, opportunity? You think about like JAG, somebody who enlists and does something like that, but then goes through law school and then ends up, pursuing JAG. That's a very different type of military service at that point. And then also people that just reenlist that are, really good at what they do. There are absolutely people. I have this joke, which isn't really a joke, but something that I say from time to time to a retired sergeant major who works on our team, Michael M. Polson, that if he was my sergeant major, it would have been problematic because I would have reenlisted, right? Because he's such a good leader, right? Like he is so authentic and so good and so motivating. If I had seen him in that role, I could have seen like, oh, okay, like there's people at that level, right, that really believe in troop welfare and that are really being able to do that sort of thing. So, I wouldn't be here, but I do think that there are absolutely people that stay in for the long haul, that do it for whether or not, whatever the reasons were, that they are accomplishing a, net positive.
I've had a few people on this show that the way that they talk about it and talk about the service, all of them I think are actually former Marines, but the way that they talk about it, I'm like, oh man, maybe it's got me like questioning things like, man, maybe I need to go down to the recruiter's office. Like, it's interesting how a leader like that and the way that they speak about it, it's so real to them, and it kind of comes over you, and like
Right.
it makes you feel that feeling that you get when the anthem plays, and like
Right.
just all of those things. It's a good feeling. I'm sure that feeling would be quickly taken away as you're on the drill floor at boot camp again.
Sure.
But
Well,
it's something to think about.
but there's a couple concrete examples. So one is challenge coins, right? Like I was fairly cynical about challenge coins. I think that they've jumped the shark in the sense that now they're everywhere, but every company can print challenge coins, right? And I think a challenge coin has to mean something, right? Like I think that's the point of them. And so I had just sort of like, cynically said, what, WSP is not going to do challenge coins. But actually summer of 2020, I got to see this guy who I mentioned, retired sergeant major Liam Polson, on our team present challenge coins to some of our stakeholders at different host institutions. And it fundamentally changed my view of challenge coins, to the point that then we did end up ordering some of them for our 10th anniversary. And it became something which was very meaningful for me to be able to give those out to folks on our team, right? And so it's this iconic aspect of military culture that I had just sort of put in a box of like, you know what, these are, I don't like culturally what these are signifying. I didn't have ones that I felt particularly like there were these, even ones that I had that had some meaning. It wasn't enough to really drive it, and just sort of wrote it off. But coming back to that as a veteran and seeing the meaning in it because of that really exemplary way in which he gave those coins and how authentic and meaningful it was, something there's something about that to me of that I think is important, right? Like the ways in which we view our service changes over time. I mean, actually, I realize now that I did somewhat avoid your question about sort of like the role of writing for me on the when I was in undergrad, but this ties into the things you've been saying. As you've been having conversations with veterans, right? Your reflections, your own reflections of your service have changed, right? Or like the ways in which you view it, not only your knowledge of other people, but how you filter through, you know, your experience and the lens through which you're looking at those things in the rearview mirror changes. There's this phenomenal book I have here. It just came out a couple of days ago, but it's Ben Kessling, Bravo Company, and I'm powering through it. I got a chance to meet him yesterday. It's remarkable. So he's a Marine Corps officer, but this is about 82nd Airborne Army Unit, Bravo Company that, you know, went through hell, and it's the before, during, and after of their deployment. But he writes it in a way that is it like actually really lands, and it seems it is very real. And so one of the interesting things when I was talking to him a little bit is just like, what impact does that have on you, right? Like you're not writing about your own military experience, but you're going through this exhaustive process over the course of multiple years, you know, to be able to process this. Like the ways in which again, his lens now is different than when he started that project, right? Or your lens is different than when you started the podcast. And so being mindful of that, you know, how we sort of that hindsight bias it's such a fascinating, I think it's a necessary thing, right? Like to be able to actually process it, to have the conversations and to write and to read. It's not always easy, but yeah, it's fluid.
You had a really good post on LinkedIn talking about the feeling of inadequacy and how that played into your time in law school. And I'd love to kind of have you talk through that. And then kind of I'd love to look at it through a military lens and see kind of how that affected you then, and then like how you think about it now.
Sure. Yeah. So this comes from, so one of my really good friends in law school, really smart guy, you know, consistently downplayed his intellect and, you know, sort of his role. And we spent a lot of time with each other in study groups and other things like this. And he's kicking ass now, by the way, as an attorney. So, you know, jokes on him in law school where he didn't really believe that like he would have what it takes. He's doing great things. But one of us at one point, you know, was just sort of made this phrase about like, man, law school is really just 1,001 ways to feel inadequate, right? That like, no matter what you do, there's always something else that you see somebody else doing that you think like, oh, well, like I can't hold a candle to them, right? If you get cold called, right, and you're in your property class and you give some sort of answer and maybe you make it through, right? It doesn't have to be awful, but then somebody else, you know, identifies the way in which one justice, you know, wrote a line in the dissent that, you know, counteracts what somebody said in the majority. You think like, oh my God, like that guy is on another level, right? Like I can't even come close to competing. Or, you know, the extracurriculars, my God, right? There's a moot court and there's trials, all of these things, right? And there's 1,000 activities you can do that you should be doing that's all important for your resume. So you can get this, you know, ideal at clerkship, and then the rest of your life is set. Right. And then you're just sitting there like, man, I'm just trying to like learn the material. Like I'm just trying to, you know, do well enough that I can get the job that I want. And it's all relative, right? We were at a great law school. We had a really good time. By the way, whenever I find out that a veteran wants to go to law school, after I sort of suss out my standard questions of like, okay, do you know any attorneys that are doing this work? If not, like start there, right? Like you got to be able to, you know, build your network, make sure you want to go there. Once they know that they want to go, my question is, all right, you know, what's your top law school that you want to go to, and why isn't it UVA, right? Like I love University of Virginia for law school. I'm an advocate for Michigan, where I went for undergrad, and I think it can be a good fit for some folks, but UVA was an excellent experience. But even in the supportive culture where I had all of these people around me that I really actually felt like, you know, believed in me, that wasn't deeply competitive, just constantly fighting the sense of inadequacy. And the point that I was making with that LinkedIn post, we talk so much about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. And sometimes we describe that in a way as if it's like a thing that happens at one point in time, and then you like no longer feel like an imposter. But I still feel when I log into LinkedIn and I see what other leaders are doing, I still feel like either an imposter of like, oh, like I didn't think of that thing, that idea, like the way to pitch that particular person or this type of programming. Therefore, I am an imposter in this area, right? Like I don't actually have what it takes to succeed there. Or even if I don't get the sense of imposter syndrome, at a minimum, I could pull up whatever LinkedIn feeds me right now, right? And I would guarantee like 5 posts, right? I would see something where my reflection would internally just be like, oh, like I should have done that. Like I should have thought of that thing. Like I should have, just 1,001 ways to feel inadequate.
It's interesting as you're saying that. I'm picturing LinkedIn as kind of like, it's the professional version of Instagram, where Instagram, we've got this like, oh man, I like definitely don't look that good in a swimsuit. And it's like, well, I definitely didn't get that job. Like,
Yeah.
it is incredibly ripe with, I think, a little bit of the nature kind of the platform promotes this kind of gloating mentality a little bit. And
Right.
I don't know if there's something in how it's programmed that like really just throws fuel on the fire for that. And everybody kind of like wants to gas each other up. But, and it makes me question too, when I look at these things, I'm like, am I the only one that's feeling like, am I envious? Like, are all these other people like, why are they congratulating them?
Right.
Like this is nothing. Like,
right.
It is then it makes me question. I'm like, maybe I'm the one with the problem here. So I'm
Exactly.
I'm glad that you also kind of
Exactly.
feel maybe similar.
That's exactly right. I mean, it is that. I mean, it really filters down into like, oh, everybody else has everything figured out, right? Like I'm the one that doesn't have something figured out, right? I'm the problem here. I'm the one that needs to. And there is an aspect there, like there's a positive angle to this, which is, like what are the opportunities for growth? Really, like realistically, when I feel that sense of inadequacy, at its core, that's probably triggered by something of like, oh, okay, this person did this thing, right? This person, say that there's like a new, say one of our partners in the VSO space secures, a really sizable corporate contribution, right? And I had some sort of second layer connection to somebody in that. And now I learn, oh, I should have pitched them, right? Okay, so what can I do with that? If internally I feel inadequate, shoot, I missed my opportunity. Well, no, okay. If they're giving to this organization, that probably means that I could have a warm ask into being able to be invited to be able to, to pitch this organization and to go to be able to sell WSP and to be able to secure a donation there. So there is sort of like, okay, feel what you're going to feel that inadequacy, right? But then do something about it. I talk about this with our students with rejection too, and I've talked about this before on a podcast or two. But so I won't go through the whole story unless it's of interest. But rejection shapes us, right? And I got rejected to University of Illinois, and that was a forcing function for me to enlist in the Marine Corps. I got out of the Marine Corps, or even before I got out, I applied to a number of schools and I got rejected, right? And, and then I was able to, work with the admissions office and take community college courses to be able to turn that into an admission. But those rejections really matter. And I think that there's a couple reactions that people have that aren't particularly productive. One is to just get so down in the doldrums and to hell with it, right? So to go to the inadequacy example, if you see something, you say, well, I'm the problem, I'm inadequate, close it out, I'm done, right? Okay, well, you missed your opportunity. And then there's also the denial of it's not me, it's everybody else, right? Like, oh, this school doesn't understand what I bring to the table, right? This reflects poorly on them, right? Or like these idiots on LinkedIn, they don't know what they have coming for them. Like I'm the real deal, right? And so fine tuning those things to be able to say like, no, okay, I was rejected. That sucks, right? I didn't do that thing. I feel inadequate. That feeling sucks. But now what do I do with it, right? Feel what you're going to feel and then channel that into some actual, again, net positive.
One of the things that I think is interesting about the military is, and as we're talking about this, I'm realizing that kind of all of life is that way. You're never really, quote, making it. You don't know who you're being looked up to as somebody in that role when you talk about things that you do.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, that's really aspirational for me. That's you never really get to hear those things. The way the world works, it doesn't want you to like be too happy, but there certainly is this process that's programmed into how the military works, where it's, oh, this unit used to be so much more tough before you got here, or like this deployment that you didn't go on. Or I know I certainly fell down the trap of even just deploying one time, and it's like, well, if I would have done one more, then it would have like meant something else. And
Right.
it's just this vicious loop of like trying to find meaning and satisfaction in things that ultimately, if you're looking to those things, it's never going to be there.
Right.
I don't think that it ever will.
So yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I think that maybe your synopsis of it is better than how I typically will articulate this or think through it. But the hierarchical nature of the military, and sort of the like just wait attitude is something which I think is really interesting, right? Like, okay, you're in boot camp, like just wait to go to combat training. Or you go to combat training, just wait until you're in, A school or whatever the thing is. Okay, just wait until you're in the fleet. Okay, just wait until you deploy, right? Just wait until you deploy again, right? Just wait until you have some sort of combat experience, right? There's always this this nature. And at some point you have to be able to like, well, where do you derive your self-worth, right? Is it because of, other people that are going to be consistently defining those things for you? Or is it because, okay, this is why I enlisted, right? I've achieved that, right? I'm comfortable. Again, like I said, like I am proud of my service, despite my, the things that cognitive dissonance that I hold in it of still wondering whether or not on balance I did good. However you want to define good. I am proud of it. And I do think that I was able to accomplish a lot, knowing full well that there is plenty more that I could have accomplished, right? I've also talked about this a lot, that like I was an average Marine, right? Like one of the tropes that I do not like, it's not just when people describe all veterans as all service members and veterans as heroes, but it's also as leaders, right? Like not everybody's a leader, right? That fundamentally on its face cannot be the way that everything works. And you could define leadership and, in smaller things. And I guess there's a way to be able to parse that word, but not everybody is, not everybody's heading up a squad or a fire team or what have you. And I was a very average Marine. I had a few minimal opportunities to be able to lead, but most of who I am today as a leader, it still is heavily informed by my military experience, but it's not as if I just like grew up as a leader in the course of those 5 years and then am able to draft on all of that for what I do today. I think other people in the course of an initial enlistment have unreal leadership experience, right? Some people have opportunities in those years, whether it's in a combat forum or whether it's through anything else, that nobody else, other people in the rest of their lives wouldn't be able to have. So I don't know at all. I think that trying to identify, getting yourself out of that hierarchical mindset and just sort of like, well, I wasn't able to achieve this level that somebody told me was the important thing to be able to achieve, but instead honest reflection of, okay, what did I get out of that experience, and how do I move forward, right? How do I actually pick up and and move on? You talked about this in your interview, right? I mean, the sense of just like you pick up different experiences, right? You're interested in, I like the one where you're talking about, you're interested in potentially running a coffee shop. So you just like get a job at a coffee shop, right? You go and you get that type of experience. You seek those types of things out and you channel, okay, you have your military experience, you have these things that you're doing, and then you build something out of that, right? All these component pieces into, who you are and what you're doing now.
What kinds of things do you measure yourself against today as like kind of your defining self-worth, or your own personal measuring stick, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, so realistically, part of the reason that I have that as a pinned post on my LinkedIn profile is I still feel that, right? Like I want to acknowledge that. I want to be real about the fact that I have that, but candidly, a measuring stick for me, for better or for worse, is still the people that are in this orbit, right? The fellow leaders from other VSOs. And, it's a really supportive network, which I like a lot, right? The veteran community is very supportive. And I think that most of the leaders in this space are very supportive and not really looking through things through the lens of, funding competitiveness or anything like that. But I still will constantly measure myself against them and against other people. So sometimes I do a better job of being able to tease out my own, how I should be measuring myself worth versus how I do. But I think that those are two different questions. Professionally, there's also some metrics that, we put together a strategic plan. And if we hit the strategic plan, right, if we hit the goals, then that's some aspect that is tied to like how I view my capacity as a leader in this organization, right? So like self-worth, I am somebody that needs to bring his whole self or close to his whole self into my work, right? I can't really tease those things out successfully in the long run. I can do it if I need to. And I'm in corporate litigation, right? I'm not the same sort of person. I can't really bring all of my attributes and, to bear there. But in this job, I do very much measure, my ability to be able to grow and to be able to lead based off of our ability as an organization to accomplish what we say we're going to accomplish, right? What we are telling donors, hey, we need your donations in order to be able to hit these milestones. If we don't hit those milestones, then I feel that, I internalize that, right? As do I know other members of our team. And I also think there's this important part of self-worth, which has to be disconnected from work, right? So as I mentioned, I have a 2-year-old and I have a 4-year-old, and, I have my wife and I have been together for many, many years at this point. And so a lot of self-worth, there's nothing quite like, a kid. If I come back from a trip and, my son says like, oh, I'm so happy to see you, Dad. He's in this phase now where he's just kind of like effusive for things like that. And it's the best, right? Because it's going to go away in an instant, right? And then he's not going to want to care. He's not going to want to spend any time with me, right? But that really does make you feel like $1 million, right? And sort of like all these other things about work and all the other conversations we're having kind of melt away under the opinion of, how your kids view you, or how your loved ones view you. And then I think there's the third category, some kind of teasing out like the professional side, the family side. On a personal level, I feel if I get caught in a wormhole of social media and, wasting time watching reels and TikTok and, shortening my attention span, and I haven't like read a book in, 3 months, that I start to feel some kind of way, right? Like there's some aspect of just like self-worth that I feel like I have to be like, I want to be learning. I want to be pushing myself to like spend my time outside of my, job to be growing and to not be static. I take that seriously. That's harder to measure, right? I could put really quantifiable goals there, but I don't. But I think it's an important part of like how candidly I sort of assess myself and how things are going.
How did you get involved with the Warrior Scholar Project program to begin with?
Yeah, so one of my friends from Second Radio Battalion, who I deployed with and who I went to language school with at DLI, he was one of the very few student veterans that was at Yale back in 2013 was when he called me. I think he started there in 2012. And they had a small group there had started a pilot, like a very early pilot of Warrior Scholar Project. They launched it in 2012. They brought a group of, I think, 9 veterans to campus, and they ran them through this crash course and, a truncated version of what the student veterans were learning as part of the Eli Whitney program, which is meant to serve students from a really diverse array of walks of life and transfer students. And it worked, right? They ran this in 2012 and it worked. And it was all very homegrown, all very Yale centric. So in 2013, they were looking to grow it. And so my friend, who had been helping out with that initial program, the initial pilot of Warrior Scholar Project at Yale, sent me a note and said, hey, I know you've been involved with student veteran advocacy, so you should come check this out. I guess we skipped over, a lot of this. But when I got out, when I was at Michigan, the folks that helped me find my way were fellow student veterans, right? Like I needed that. I needed a community of people. I wanted some distance in between myself and sort of military identity and veteran identity, but those are the people that we had common ground, right? And so I ended up getting involved with our Student Veterans of America chapter there, and had gotten increasingly heavily involved with it. And Michigan, for a few reasons that aren't worth going into here, were on the radar for the founders at Warrior Scholar Project. So it led to this call, and I said, sure, I'll come out and see it, right? Having really no idea what it was. And I was working at the time, I was teaching high school. So I only had a day, right? I like literally one day that I could fly out to New Haven to see this thing. And I stepped into a class that was already in session. And for that second year, it was a group of about a dozen veterans, about half active duty and half veterans. And they were going toe to toe in this discussion on Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America with the professor, the late Charles Hill, who's this legendary professor at Yale, right? And it was just like this like really fulsome discussion. And I was like, what universe did I step into here, right? Like what classroom is this active? Like what class, where are people this? And none of my experiences in undergrad, right? And I had some great classes where like this engaged, where people did the readings and they were, and the professor was taking the time to be able to work for, no compensation. And, it's not part of his tenure or anything like that.
Coming from teaching high school too, I'm assuming there's a pretty sharp contrast in students.
A little different, right? You're right. So I was in. And then for the next 5 years, that was my involvement. Was we launched a pilot of the program at Michigan. And then when I was going through law school and working as an attorney, I would carve out a couple of weeks each summer to come back and to, wrestle up the instructors and to serve the students and do all of these things. And it was incredibly life-giving, right? Every time it would end, I would say, oh man, if there's only way I could do that full time, if there was only way I could do that full time. And that opportunity came about in 2018, met up with one of the founders for old time's sake and said, man, if there was only way I could do WSP full time. And he said, well, what if there was? So I took the jump.
How has the program changed from that initial where you like went out there to see what it was? Maybe could you describe what the program it was? I understand that it's student veterans and it's just at Yale, but like what exactly was being offered, and then maybe how that changed over time to maybe up through today.
Yeah. So the one of the things that I like about WSP is that some parts of it haven't changed at all, right? And that's actually a really important part. For as much as we've grown, as much as we've refined, right, the core offering, like the intent of WSP and the way in which it's executed really hasn't changed. I struggled for a long time with the name Warrior Scholar Project, right? I felt like Warrior was overblown, as was Scholar. And I had to think about that for years, right? And now I actually really like it because I arrived at this point just based off a lot of conversations with people that had gone through the program that warrior is an ethos, right? Not everybody's an infantryman. I was an infantryman, right? I wasn't in combat, right? I don't consider myself to be a warrior. You come out of boot camp, it doesn't really matter what your job is, right? You come out of it feeling like, okay, I'm part of a unit, right? That warrior ethos. And the same thing is true with our programs, right? We have some incredible students, but what does it mean to actually be a scholar, right? Like in the classical sense, in a week, are you going to go from not being a scholar to being a scholar? No, right? But you don't have to be, pursuing this incredible, groundbreaking PhD dissertation in order to be a scholar. It's the ethos, right? It's do I see myself as being able to succeed in the classroom? Yes. That's an ethos, right? So that was true in the initial version of the program, taking people that had a wide variety of military services and putting them into the classroom and helping them understand, okay, there's a way to be able to translate that experience and who I am and to actually be able to see myself as kicking ass in the classroom, right? So much of it is about this mentality and the support structure. It's always got to be heavily involved and led by, I think, enlisted veterans. I think that's this really important component of it, right? At some layer, right? So much of this revolves around mentorship from our alumni that have gone through the program that then come back. They're not 30 steps ahead in the process, right? They're 5 steps ahead of the people that they're leading. They went through the program last summer. Now they're at all of these schools and they're applying those skills and they're coming back and they're saying, hey, I took this course and here's how it's working. So that level of authenticity, I think, is really important. And then the intensity, that's also something which was true in the initial cohorts, which is still there now. It's about 70 to 80 hours of work per week. So it's really rigorous, but veterans respond really well to that, right? You throw it on the gauntlet and you say, look, you're here. We guarantee it's going to be worth it, right? We have the data from 2,300 students to show you why it's going to be worth it. So trust the process and you're going to work and then it works. So those aspects are still the same. Some of the readings have changed, right? Of course, faculty members have changed, right? The structure, some of the timing for sessions, have revised. We collect a ton of post-course data from folks because we're always looking for ways to be able to improve the program. But at its core, it still is, for the humanities program, you're reading dense humanities materials, you're turning into sophisticated college level discussion and college level writing, and you're having conversations around the social and psychological aspects of transition. What is it like to be a veteran on a college campus?
You mentioned a couple times there, the data that you're seeing about what you collect to improve and kind of what you see over the course of all of the cohorts that you've run at. You're involved in like a whole bunch of schools. As a data nerd here, so I'm gonna I'd love to drill into that.
Yeah.
What kinds of things do you guys see what kind of efficacy does the Warrior Scholar Project offer in terms of like reaching this desired outcome?
Yeah. So the core thing that is really helpful for us, but is also elusive, right? If you're a data nerd, this one might drive you crazy, but one of the ways that we measure success is confidence level, right? And the problem with confidence level is that I'm unaware of any objective way to really measure confidence, right? But what we've found, and there's a decent amount of research primarily having to do with first generation students, but it tracks for non-first gen as well, is that if somebody has confidence, then they are much more likely to succeed. That sounds painfully obvious. It is painfully obvious, But at the same time, it means that if you want somebody to believe in themselves, or if you want somebody to believe that they should be applying to whatever school or whatever program is the best fit for themselves, they are not going to do that unless they are confident enough to submit the application, right? And so thinking through that, that's why about 50% of our population every summer is comprised of active duty service members. If I had my druthers, everybody would take WSP who's interested in pursuing college. Everybody would take it before they get out, before they've spent any GI Bill dollars, before they've made some of these decisions about, where they want to go or how they want to spend their time, because we want to be able to have them see, okay, don't just go for what you think you can accomplish, right? You can actually accomplish a lot more. And then here are some of the skills along the way. So other things that we measure, right, in terms of things like, the writing instructors are giving a lot of concrete feedback on growth on writing levels, right, and being able to provide really precise, comments that are tailored to the students. Those things really matter. Things like somebody's self-assessment of their reading ability, right, and whether or not they feel like they have tools to be able to succeed, their own assessment of how confident they are that they will succeed in the transition. That's a lot of the short-term data. The medium and long-term outcomes that we measure through an alumni survey is like, where did you actually end up going to school, right? How are you doing, right? It would be insufficient for us to just say, well, okay, you had a good feeling when you left the course, so good luck, see ya, right? One key stat that we track there is what's the persistence rate, right? Meaning what's the rate of students that are actually going through WSP and that then are either have graduated or that are on track to complete their degree within 6 years. 6 years is sort of the standard defined, even though college degrees, people think about it in terms of 4 years, 6 years is how persistence rates are generally measured. And for us, that's over 90%, right? The most recent data, which there's a big asterisk because it's not all that recent now, but the best data source still suggests that 72% of student veterans, that's the overall persistence rate for student veterans. So we talk about that growth from degree persistence rate. And then where are students actually going, right? So it's like 1% of student veterans make up less than 1% of the overall US News top 20 student body. And so for us, we have like 30% of our alumni last year are at those same schools, right? So that's not an apples to apples comparison, but where are they actually applying? And neither of those are to say that if somebody decides not to pursue the degree, let alone at one of those institutions, that they're a failure, right? It's just that we want people to not self-select out of those things. We want them to be able to see those as the options and then make an informed decision. Do I need to go to school? If so, where am I going? How is that tying to my career path? All of those, et cetera, et cetera.
This is probably a question I should have asked at the very beginning, but can you maybe outline who this program is for and it like specifically where in that journey they can be applying for it, and then like what some of the like initial requirements for in terms of like what schools are eligible, etc.
See, if I was doing my job well, then I would have just answered that question without even asking it at the outset, right? I would have said, all right, before we go any further, let me explain what WSP is. Here I am describing, the outcomes and sort of the—
You're a guest. You're a guest.
Yeah.
That's my job.
Yeah. So look, so the one hard and fast— there's a couple eligibility criteria. The hard and fast one is enlisted, right? Obviously, you understand enlisted versus commission. I find myself describing this all the time. So I'll say it just in case folks on this podcast, listening to it aren't familiar with it, but enlisted meaning as compared to commission, right? Enlisted not meaning active duty. That's one of the primary issues that we have with folks is they hear enlisted and think, oh, you're only serving people that are in active duty. No, I am an enlisted veteran, right? I wasn't at— you get this distinction. But, originally the genesis for WSP was really focused on enlisted pursuing undergraduate degrees. And so there was this natural separation where commissioned officers by definition have their undergraduate degree by the time that they commission, right? So they would be ineligible. Over time, there's a caveat, there's an asterisk next to the requirement of not yet having completed a bachelor's degree, because we found that there's a lot of folks that either completed a degree years ago that isn't doing anything for them, or that just recently completed a bachelor's degree, but they got swept up in the predatory for-profit school industry or something of that nature. So now when somebody applies, if they served as a commissioned officer, right, best of luck to you, but WSP isn't, you're not eligible for WSP. But on the bachelor's degree side, we say, okay, tell us about, where you achieve your bachelor's. Let's make sure that these programs are still actually a good fit for you. We have a network of a little over 20 schools, great schools throughout the country, and students don't have to be matriculating or even necessarily interested in attending that school. So the idea is that we want them to be able to experience what that's like in an ungraded, unaccredited environment, right? You have to have the drive to be able to say, I want to spend a week or 2 weeks at at Yale, at UChicago, at USC, right, at Cornell, right, at these institutions throughout the country. So you can select which ones are your preference, and then we have to, depending on when you apply, and our admissions teams works with folks to be able to try and find the best fit there. That's for our core academic boot camps. So enlisted, typically not somebody that has a bachelor's degree, but if they do and somebody can articulate a reason why this makes sense for them to go through, then welcome in. And then it becomes a matter of working with our team once you're admitted to get admitted to a particular program. Then there's the graduate school mentorship side. Right now, that's a service which is only available to our alumni that are then pursuing graduate school, but that's going to open up in the coming years. I think that, I personally and WSP as an organization, we want to see more enlisted veterans in excellent graduate school programs as well. It's great that there's pipelines for, again, officers to be able to go there. That's fantastic. But in addition to that, we need more enlisted veterans seeing themselves as achieving success at those types of programs. So that's going to be a big part of our build out in the coming years.
Is Warrior Scholar Project available to, I saw some verbiage on the website talking about SkillBridge. How does SkillBridge integrate with WSP?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've used SkillBridge for years and years and years, and recently we've gotten some questions about this because there is a program, DoD SkillBridge, right? So this is meant to be something which is talking about SkillBridge in the small s SkillBridge level, right? This idea of channeling the skills from the military into higher education and beyond. So we don't have a formal relationship with DoD SkillBridge.
Okay, I gotcha. That makes sense. I imagine that the level of programming that you guys are offering requires immense buy-in from the universities. You're having teachers from that school help participate in this thing, and are they paid? And I just kind of really want to harp a little bit on the value that people might be getting by being taught by university or professors from these top school universities.
Yeah. So we do definitely, it's a partnership, right? It is a formal partnership with each one of these institutions, because it's not something where we just sort of are an outside party that's renting facilities that, we happen to be on this campus, right? We want it to be something that the student can get a sense of what it's really like to actually be a student there. So it is a commitment, certainly from the institutions, and it is a long process of going back and forth with an institution to make sure that we're a right fit and to plan it appropriately. There's 3 categories of instructors at each course. So one, I'll start with the ones that I mentioned before, talking about the alumni mentors. So the alumni they go in groups of 3 to 4, depending if it's humanities, STEM, or business. Those are the 3 substantive areas of programming we offer. And they are embedded with the students, right? They're sleeping in the residence halls, they're eating in the dining facilities, they're with the students from sunup to sundown. They are mentoring them, and they're also instructing, right? So they have some formal instruction that they're doing about how to be a successful student, but a lot of it is also the mentorship and the soft skills, right? Again, about what is it like, when I've done these before, it's okay, I had this tight knit unit, and then I'm one of 28,000 undergrads, right? Wondering who the hell are my people, and what have I done? So the alumni mentors are this really vital component. We talk about it as the secret sauce for WSP. The second component are the faculty members. So faculty members, we're asking them to volunteer about 3 hours of their time. So it's not an onerous commitment, and it's meant to be something which is in their area of expertise. So Harvard, we have he's a brilliant and renowned professor, Michael Klarman. So we have a section on the constitutional framework. Unit 2 is about the constitutional framework. I'm not going to tell Michael Klarman how to teach on the constitutional framework, right? But we say, look, the students will have read these materials when they show up to your course. The seminar is yours to run however you see fit. So we try and make it as low of a lift as we can for the faculty members who are actually volunteering, right? No stipend, no honorarium, 3 hours in an area of their choosing. What we find is that when somebody comes once, they want to come back year and again, year over year, because they have this response of wow, I wish all of my students were that engaged. We sincerely hear that all the time. And then the third category of instructors are the writing instructors on the humanities side, STEM project leaders on the STEM side, and entrepreneurship group leaders on the business side. They are paid because they're with the students for about 20 hours per week. So they come from the institution. Sometimes they'll come from the writing center. Sometimes they're PhD candidates. Sometimes they're faculty members, but they receive a stipend because they're actually with the students doing a substantive skill in the afternoon for about 20 hours over the course of those 7 or 8 days.
I think it's very easy to, on the surface level, say and explain the value of what a degree does for somebody. I don't think that anybody would argue that. It's access to better jobs, it's better knowledge, better more effective learning, all of these things. What have you learned being the CEO of WSP, as what have you learned about the value of a degree in the hands of a capable veteran
Yeah.
since working there?
So it's a thoughtful question. I haven't been asked that directly before. So I'll give you what my answer first impression is, and probably chew on that one a little bit more afterwards too. So I think that there's a transactional answer, and then there's the deeper answer. So the transactional answer is that there's a lot of jobs that do just require a degree, right? Sometimes that's something which is required in a specific area of study, and other times it's just a check in the box. And so at its core, right, I think that there is an inherent value in a degree for a lot of jobs, or it is a prerequisite for a lot of jobs. And sometimes that's sufficient, right? And sometimes even a non-degree is sufficient, to the point earlier about being an informed consumer. Look, if the job that I want to go to, I was talking to somebody yesterday, is connected to WSP, supports this trade union that is just desperate for people that are willing to do asbestos removal, right? And it's a 6-figure job with incredible benefits, right? But they just can't find anybody, right? So if somebody went through our program and was like, you know what, I have what it takes to succeed there, but like, here's the opportunity, that would be great. They don't need that value of the degree. So that's my caveat, that I acknowledge that not every job requires a degree, but for those that do, for some people, it is that really important point. I think the deeper side of it, so much of, we talk a lot about in our programs about, the roles of diversity and inclusion, right? These are really meaningful words, and there's a lot of like very necessary discussion about that these days. But what we try and simulate in our programs, right, is we're not like, our outreach team is trying to put together diverse cohorts, and we mean that in all different senses, right? Example I use for this, and this, I swear I'll bring this back to an answer to your question, but when the transgender ban was lifted a couple of years ago, right, I'm part of groups that were celebrating that were thinking like, this is amazing, right? Like, this is, like, thank goodness, this is incredible. And then I'm also part of some, other groups, right? Some private online groups, or like Marine Corps groups, if you go like Marine Corps forums or those types of things, that there were a number of people that were saying incredibly vitriolic and, inappropriate stuff. And like, this is the end of our military. And here's the thing about, Warrior Scholar Project. And I think that the extension is to college, and the deeper answer here is like the richness of an experience is putting people from both sides of that conversation in a classroom with each other, reading Fed 10 or reading to Tocqueville, right? And being able to have a discussion and be able to bring their perspectives. I think that is really the deeper value, that like the reason why there's plenty of reasons to be cynical about higher education and college and cost of college and the way and things are. Again, we could have hours and hours and hours of discussion about that, and there's tons written. But I do think that at its core, a college experience should expose you to a wide variety of opinions for things that you previously just, either hadn't considered or kind of like rejected. So we try and simulate a lot of that at WSP, right? I don't want a group of people that just all think the same, that all have the same answer to a question. And I don't think colleges want that. In fact, I know that's not what colleges want. So I think that that's the deeper meaning to a lot of the degrees, right? Not just the transactional nature, check the box, now I can apply and be, eligible for this job, but also college really actually dramatically expanded my worldview, and I know why I believe what I believe, or I came out with a series of questions that I don't have answers to, and that's kind of uncomfortable, but also necessary.
Having more questions is, I think, it's a good sign in your own personal development,
I
understanding
agree.
that you know less and less about the world than you thought. I think that that's a really great sign.
Yeah.
At the helm of this big ship that you're steering, WSP, what is your vision for what the next 5-10 years looks like for the program? What would you really like to be doing, other than, you mentioned the graduate program, and maybe if that's a sole focus, maybe we can kind of take that apart a little bit, but where
Yeah.
do you see this going?
Yeah, so yeah, graduate school is an important part of it. Another thing is, as an organization, I want us to do, a better job at tying together the career outcomes with educational outcomes, right, in the decision-making process. So, we are not a workforce development organization. There are organizations that do that all day, every day. So we don't want to replicate that. So there's a lot of like strong referral pipelines. But I do want us to do, I think if we're doing the best version of our job to actually execute the mission and come closer to, achieving the vision, education doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Education is a component to what comes next, right? Education for the sake of education is, in the vast majority of cases, a bad idea. So building out career services, again, not workforce development, but thinking about how do we leverage the relationships that we have with individual alumni and understanding their needs and what they're looking for with relationships we have with companies that are looking to be able to pair those things up, not just with like, here's a batch of resumes, hopefully you hire some of them, but more meaningful, career connections. And even if it's not us ultimately placing people in the hands of certain, recruiters for different institutions, just having them think through, how does education feed into my wider goals, right? We do that informally now, but we need to build out a more formal way to be able to help people understand the connective tissue in between higher education and the career side. And then the other area is I am increasingly concerned, right? The thing that sometimes quite literally keeps me up at night is thinking about all the people that we're not reaching and why that's the case, right? So next year, we'll serve about 400 people through academic boot camps. We'll serve 600 or 700 through a variety of other services, through workshops and alumni services and those things. So, call it 1,000 people. That's fantastic, right? I love the thing that we do. It's absolutely, fantastic. But no matter which estimate you look at, it's always in excess of 150,000 people that are leaving the service each year. Tens of thousands of them are qualified for WSP, but there's a barrier to entry, right? We talked about confidence. If you're not confident to apply to University of Illinois, we have a program there now. If you're not confident enough to apply to University of Illinois, you may not be confident to apply to WSP at University of Illinois, even though those are two distinct entities. And so a lot of people, I think, that may visit the website and sort of like, oh, okay, I'm interested, may self-select out because they should see that it's rigorous, right? Like, this is an intensive residential commitment. We now have a virtual offering of the boot camps, but that still is an intensive commitment, right? That's in excess of 60 hours in a week, right? And they really work. We're doing a couple of those in December. But we are actively planning to do a WSP on demand, which lowers the impacts are lower because we don't have people that we can actually do any sort of face-to-face work with, or those like magical conversations that happen on the path when people are walking together from like a really tough seminar to dinner, right? And I'm like, that's like the real good stuff comes in play. Can't do that in WSP on demand, but in terms of accessibility and lowering the barrier to entry, it's enormous, right? So you think about something where, okay, you go through TAP. Well, I didn't really learn anything about how to be a good student at TAP. So I'm going to log onto this thing. It's free, right? I'm going to start to get that information. And then that we can actually have that be something that feeds into the boot camps, right? If this is actually a useful thing that you derived a lot of value from it, let's talk about if a boot camp's the right fit for you. So a big part of our strategic growth has to be the quality control and continuing to refine and judiciously grow what we currently do, right? Growing boot camps, but not to be on 150 campuses. That's not the goal of WSP. So continuing to do what we do well, growing things like graduate school and graduate school programming and the career development side. And then this new area of a different modality of our programming that I think stands to actually move the needle for the wider veteran population and reach a bunch of people that just don't have the confidence in themselves, but that really need these services in order to unlock their full potential.
You've kind of already outlined some of the things that it would take to make you successful in both of those goals. Let's fast forward the clock a little bit, maybe say 5 years, and say that you didn't meet either of those. What do you think would have been the biggest roadblock to accomplishing those?
Yeah, it's we can look at previous years, and I can pull from like actual data about like what are the things that have led us to not accomplishing our goals in the past as well. There are some unforeseeable events like the pandemic, right, that fundamentally changed the nature of our world. And I think one of the lessons from that is like, okay, don't ever get too cocky in a certain service model, right? You might have to pivot on short notice, right? On an individual level, on a family level, on a professional level, organizational, all of these things. But there is our team is tired of me talking about this, I'm sure, at this point, but the way that I've thought about it is we need to be able to have, there's this three-legged stool analogy, right? Where we need to be able to have one leg of the stool is the programming and the students that we serve. We need to be able to have that leg of the stool be robust and reliable. And if we're growing, then it needs to be able to grow so that it doesn't put the other two legs off. A second leg is the infrastructure, and primarily there I mean the team, right? Like the team, this actually has to be like a sustainable place that people really are excited to work for and that they see themselves working for in the long haul, because it's inefficient for us to be consistently, if we're a revolving door for people that are here, right? It's inefficient, right? So that means, we have to be really thoughtful about how we hire, how we support people, how we offer professional development opportunities, what our culture is at WSP, but we have to have that leg of the stool be really strong. And then the third leg is funding. We have to be able to pay for it all, right? And so you could push on this analogy and it may not make sense in every single example, but I think that it works because those three legs need to be roughly equal in order for us to be able to fully accomplish our mission. So if 2 years from now, if you check in and you say, hey, Ryan, like you had these strategic goals, did you actually hit it? If my answer is no, I could probably track to one of those three things. Like either we went off the path with programming and it didn't really work, or we hit some sort of roadblock where there was a quality control issue, or we tried to expand too quickly, or yada, yada, yada. Something happened on the team and the cultural side and the ways in which we were supporting people, or we ran out of funding, right? I think pretty much everything can fall into one of those three categories.
Got two final questions for you. If people want to, well, I'll put this another way. How can people help and get involved with WSP?
Yeah. So one, they can send me a note, right? rpavel at warrior-scholar.org. They can visit our website. My info is on there as well. They can find me on LinkedIn, right? And they can, figure out whatever my title is at whatever time they happen to seek me out. And I'm happy to chat with people about whether there are actual opportunities. We get a fair amount of volunteer requests, and frankly, it's hard as a nonprofit to effectively manage workload for volunteers. There's a lot of good intent out there, and it's another area that we need to build out in terms of our infrastructure. But there are some areas that it's easy to plug in, right? If somebody's from one of our host institutions and says, hey, I heard about this thing, I have this to offer, I would love to be able to drop in, that's a lot easier than somebody that just says, hey, what can I do? Right? The answer there is much more difficult. And then there's also the on the financial support side, right? We're a 501c3. And so, that information is on our website as well, right? We're entirely donor funded, which is another very concrete and appreciated way to support.
The last question is, what is it that we can take away from this conversation, learning from you, Ryan, and implement today or maybe tomorrow? We're talking in the evening. We'll start tomorrow.
Yeah, we were supposed to talk in the afternoon, but then I messed us up. I don't know. It's tough. I think that the thing that I try and lean on, and again, we talked about the LinkedIn posts, and my attempt there is to try and really be authentic and real in how we talk about our experiences, and not to sugarcoat things, and also not to, in some kinds, it's easier to be self-disparaging and not to be able to highlight your own accomplishments, but I really think there's something about like that authentic engagement, right? Like, and that's not only for extroverts, that's not only for people that are like really excited about connecting and that want to be able to go on all these events, right? I think that no matter where you're working or no matter how you're engaging with the world through a screen or or in person, trying to find a way to be able to bring your whole self to the conversations, I think that really matters. And I think that nuance is lost in a lot of the ways in which we communicate with each other these days. So I to the extent that that's a takeaway, it's less tangible than I would like. I like that you end your sessions in that way, but that point of reflection for people about, what your experiences are, who you are, and where you're going. I think if we're more reflective and authentic and open about those things, I think that's a net positive.
It's very aspirational and very difficult, especially when our own personal reflections and ideas about things are moving, and then communicating those is also a moving target as well.
So good luck, everybody.
Right. Here's what you should do. Have fun. Ryan, this has been a super fun conversation. I appreciate you joining me. Any other place you want to send people? LinkedIn, if you want to plug the website one more time, where can people go to learn more, connect?
Yeah, warrior-scholar.org. See us there.
Perfect. Ryan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.